Hey guys, alright? Welcome everyone. We begin by seeing a will being written and then sealed with a Van Garrett seal. The document is taken by a man in a carriage, and along the way, he senses that something is amiss. Suddenly, something swiftly passes them, and the man hears the sound of sharp blades. Startled, he investigates and finds the carriage driver dead, headless. Now frightened, he leaps from the carriage and takes refuge in a nearby cornfield. He comes across a terrifying scarecrow, but evil continues to pursue him, eventually leading to his death. The scene shifts to the city of New York in 1799, where an investigator named Crane discovers a dead man in the river. At the police station, the sheriff orders the body to be burned, but Crane insists they need to determine the cause of death. The sheriff dismisses the concern. Soon, a prisoner is mercilessly thrown into the dungeon. The next day, Crane attempts to persuade the council to change their trial methods for criminals, but the judge rejects the proposal. Crane also voices his opinion that they could use reason and scientific methods to identify potential culprits. The judge recounts a recent crime in the town of Sleepy Hollow where 3 people were found decapitated within 15 days. Crane decides to investigate the case and find the perpetrator to bring them to trial. He gathers his equipment, releases his pet red bird, and heads to the town to prove his worth as an investigator. After a long journey, he arrives in Sleepy Hollow, a small town with only a few houses. Observing the empty streets, he realizes that the frightened residents are hiding. He spots a watchtower where a shift change is taking place, and a man bids farewell to his son as he takes over the watch. Crane continues to explore the town and visits the house of a town leader. He then arrives at a mansion where people are enjoying a party hosted by the owner. As he enters, he becomes involved in a game, and a beautiful young woman touches him and kisses his cheek. The young lady is Katrina, the daughter of the man Crane is looking for. A man named Brom beside them inquires about the stranger's identity. Soon, Baltus Van Tassel and his wife enter the hall. He is a successful farmer and a well-liked figure in the town. Crane introduces himself as a police investigator and explains his intention to investigate the previous deaths. Baltus offers him lodging, and later, he and his associates welcome Crane into a meeting room. Present are Dr. Thomas, Reverend Steenwick, the town judge Samuel, and James, the clerk. Baltus, who is also a town advisor and bank financier, begins to address Crane's inquiries about the murders. Crane describes the deaths of Peter Van Garrett and his son Dirk, followed by the widow's death days later. He asks if there are any suspects, which makes everyone uneasy in the investigator's presence. Baltus inquires about what has been reported to the investigator, and Crane states that they found the bodies separate from the heads. However, he learns that the heads were not found, but taken by a creature known as the Headless Horseman. Crane is puzzled and asks for an explanation. Baltus proceeds to recount what he knows about this accusation. He explains that the horseman was a mercenary sent by a princess from Germany to keep Americans under England's control. However, instead of serving his countrymen, he reveled in battle and bloodshed, becoming infamous for his mounted killings with a black steed and sharp teeth, making him more fearsome. In battles, he swiftly decapitated his opponents with a single sword stroke. In a time of cold, he was ambushed, and his horse wounded, he fled into the forest with soldiers pursuing him. Further ahead, he encounters 2 children collecting branches, and one of them inadvertently drops the branches, alerting the soldiers. The madman confronts several men and kills them with his sword. However, in a moment of carelessness, he is impaled and then beheaded with his own blade. Baltus states that the western woods are haunted, and no one dares to venture there, as evil was buried there and lay dormant for 20 years. It then awakened, and it is believed that whoever crosses its path will be killed. Crane trembles upon hearing this story, but he composes himself, not crediting their claims. He states that the killer is not an evil spirit and believes that the perpetrator is a flesh and blood person whom he will discover. As night falls, we see a man in the watchtower, noticing strange occurrences. The torches go out due to mist, and animals flee the forest in fear. A gunshot is heard, and the man flees, but the horseman pursues and kills him with his sword. The next morning, Crane rents a horse for transportation from Mr. Killian, and nearby is Elizabeth, a midwife. A rider arrives and alerts everyone to the new victim. We also see that the watchtower has been completely destroyed. Crane heads to the site where Baltus and others, including Brom, are present. Crane approaches the body to examine it, and realizing the head is missing, he questions why, even though they knew the man, his head was taken. Crane continues his analysis, utilizing his tools, and upon closer inspection, he is startled by what he sees but discovers the wound was cauterized, indicating that something hot was used. Later, as the people bury the deceased and comfort the orphan son, the young son offers to serve and assist Crane in the investigation, which the investigator declines. Samuel approaches Crane and reveals that there were not 4 deaths, but 5, and the other body is hidden in one of the graves. This makes the investigator more curious, so he asks young Mosbath to do him a favor. Early the next morning, they return to the graveyard and unearth the bodies to search for the 5th victim. While examining the woman's body, he notices a cut on her abdomen, leading him to take her to Dr. Thomas's office for further examination. Crane, wanting to concentrate, asks everyone to leave, and he is left alone with the body. As all the leaders wait outside, the investigator emerges and announces that they are dealing with a monstrous deranged killer, as he ended 2 lives at once. He reveals that the woman was pregnant. Later, Crane returns to the barn to tend to his horse. However, he hears horse neighs and, looking back, sees the Headless Horseman. Frightened, he gallops away to escape the malevolent entity. Yet, regaining his composure, he stops the horse and confronts what he believes to be a hoax of the feared entity. However, the horseman hurls a flaming pumpkin at Crane and departs. We then see that it is Brom using a cape to frighten the investigator. In the early hours of the morning, Crane goes to the pantry to have a drink. He notices a light in the adjacent room and finds Lady Katrina reading a book, which she quickly conceals. She invites him to talk and explains that her late mother gave it to her, but after her mother's death, her father forbids her from reading such romantic content, as it leads to fever and then death. She also informs Crane that the woman who was with him today was the doctor who cared for her during difficult times. Crane realizes that the Van Garretts are related to the Van Tassels. Katrina shares that in the small town, everyone has a connection, whether through blood or marriage. She recounts that when she was younger, Mr. Van Garrett granted the land they possess today. She reveals that the Van Garretts used to be the wealthiest family in the region. However, by giving land to Baltus, he worked hard to develop his family there, ultimately becoming the most successful. Katrina gives him a present, a spellbook that belonged to her late mother, Elizabeth. She then takes him to see the ruins of the small cottage that was her family's at the beginning of it all. Crane helps her dismount her horse, and she notices puncture marks on his hands. He tells her that he's had them since he was young but doesn't remember how he got them. They enter the ruined house, and she goes to the fireplace where her mother used to draw images in the ashes. They see a red bird called a cardinal, which she finds charming. To lighten the mood, he shows her a toy that uses optics to create an illusion, showing a bird that appears free and one that seems trapped. He then mentions that things are not always what they seem. Back in the town, Samuel packs his belongings and tells the other magistrates that he has decided to leave. Crane observes him leaving on his horse and becomes suspicious. He follows him and confronts him about his departure. Samuel admits to fearing the worst because he knows about the things he had told him earlier. Crane wonders if he's referring to the case of the pregnant widow and asks about the child's father, suspecting that he killed her. But Samuel claims it was the horseman. Crane dismisses the existence of such evil, but the atmosphere becomes eerie, and animals get spooked. Samuel and Crane come face to face with the Headless Horseman mounted on his black horse, unsheathing his sword. However, the entity targets Samuel and kills him. Witnessing this, Crane freezes, and when the horseman comes toward him, he merely takes the dead man's head. Crane ends up fainting. The next day, Crane locks himself in his room and refuses to come out. Baltus enters with his daughter and the young Mosbath. A frightened Crane recounts his horrifying experience with the malevolent entity and is unable to speak before fainting again. He has dreams about his mother, where they have a great time, but one day, the head of the household takes her to the kettle and erases the profane drawing she had made against his principles, punishing her afterward. Crane awakens shortly after, lost in thought in his room. Meanwhile, the leaders prepare to decide who will go to New York City. Suddenly, Crane presents himself and invites them to seek out the tomb of the deceased Headless Horseman. However, no one volunteers to go along except for the young Mosbath. In the forest, Crane speaks with the young man and inquires about his father. Mosbath reveals that his deceased father worked for the Van Garretts. One day, his father overheard an argument between a father and his son and was called in afterward. Crane senses a connection between the victims. With the surroundings quiet, they quicken their pace and soon reach a cave. Fearfully, Crane uses young Mosbath to go in first, holding his weapon. Upon entering the cave, they encounter a veiled woman. Terrified, they attempt to leave, but she grabs Crane and instructs the young man to go away. The woman sits at the table alongside the investigator and binds his hands with chains, then begins preparing a potion to lure something to them. She stops moving, and when Crane tries to wake her, she awakens with a sinister appearance and tries to grab him. The entity within the woman knows who he seeks and tells him where he must go. He must follow the Indian path to the tree of the dead and find what he seeks there. Back in the forest, Crane sees someone nearby on a horse and decides to approach on foot. Armed, he gets closer and discovers it's Katrina, who has come to help with the mission. This pleases the investigator. The young Mossbath interrupts their meeting and beckons them to see something. They've found the tree of the dead, a tree without leaves. Crane touches it and notices drops of blood dripping from its roots. He decides to cut it open to see what's inside. Blood splatters onto his face. Soon, they discover the heads of the people killed by the Headless Horseman. Crane also finds a sword above one of the roots and notices that the sand around it has been disturbed recently. He digs in the spot and uncovers bones, possibly those of the horseman himself, but missing the skull. The investigator realizes that the vengeful horseman is angry and rising from his grave to claim heads until his own is returned to its place. Suddenly, the location of the heads starts to move, and soon the Headless Horseman emerges from the grave and sets off in search of more victims. Unafraid, Crane decides to follow, but he loses sight of him. In the town, Brom and his companions decide to search for Katrina in the forest and split up, each going in a different direction. Meanwhile, at Elizabeth's house, she's having fun with her son, looking at images reflected on the wall, while Killian is taking a break. Suddenly, the atmosphere turns eerie, and the horseman breaks down the door. Killian tells Elizabeth to protect herself as he fights the Headless Horseman. However, the creature is powerful and quickly kills him. Elizabeth hides her son in the cellar of the house and unfortunately meets the same fate. The horseman is about to leave the house but senses the presence of the child and returns to claim him. Brom hears the screams and rushes back to the town. He encounters the Headless Horseman and shoots at its chest. However, nothing stops it, as the entity cannot be killed. When it rises, it passes by Brom, ignoring him, but Brom insists on fighting the evil and throws a dagger that pierces the horseman's waist. However, he's soon counterattacked and wounded in the leg. Crane arrives in time and goes to help Brom, who persists in fighting the entity. Crane informs him that they have no chance against it. They attempt to flee, but the horseman pursues them, cornering them. It wounds Crane in the shoulder. Brom continues to battle the entity and ends up being split in half. At the horrifying sight, Crane faints. Upon waking, Crane realizes he's receiving medical care, and Katrina, who knows a bit about potions, is present, giving Crane a potion. The investigator relays his findings, stating that the horseman kills with a purpose, pursuing victims under the orders of whoever controls it, concluding that the person controlling it has its head. Baltus believes that Crane's delirious due to the injury. Crane falls asleep again and has nightmares about his childhood, where he enters a forbidden room and finds various torture instruments. In the background, a chamber contains a person. The child is frightened and hurts his hands on a chair, explaining the marks on them. However, the worst is revealed: his mother was being killed in there. Crane awakens in fear, with Katrina by his side. She asks him what frightened him, and he responds that he has dreams about his mother, unjustly condemned by his tyrannical father for not adhering to the standards imposed by false biblical teachings. Crane recounts that he was very young when he lost faith in what his family believed and now only believes in cause and effect and sound reasoning. He expresses regret for coming to the town, as his mind is being challenged by the spiritual world. They grow closer, reminiscing about the kiss she gave him upon his arrival. However, he apologizes for his lack of sensitivity regarding Brom's death. Katrina reassures him. Soon after, they embrace. Later, while resting, Crane wakes up surprised to see Baltus's wife serving him. She explains that the maids left, fearing what might happen to them. Crane, somewhat recovered, resumes his investigation and writes down the connections between the victims. Young Mossbath reminds him not to forget the Van Garretts, since they're deceased, and now the town's leader is Baltus Van Tassel. Crane looks at the family tree and discovers something, then swiftly leaves his quarters. They head to the notary's house, but don't find him there. However, young Mossbath discovers his deceased father's bag and questions why it's there. Suddenly, Crane opens a closet, and the notary emerges, asking them to leave him alone. Nonetheless, Crane asks him to show the will signed by the Van Garretts. The notary only says that the document states that everything was left to the deceased son, who has also died. Therefore, by law, the will passes to someone closer to the family. The young man retrieves a new will from Van Garrett, which has already been opened, showing the deceased widow, and a second document revealing that Mr. Van Garretts secretly married this woman, leaving everything to her and her child. But there's another person who would inherit the entire fortune had such events not occurred. The notary confirms that this is true, but he and 3 others were coerced into hiding what they did. Crane then uncovers more information. The preacher conducted the marriage, the doctor discovered the pregnancy, Judge Samuel supported the legality, and finally, the notary concealed the documents in which Van Garrett handed over to his servant. The notary becomes nervous with these revelations and feels like a dead man, but Crane continues speaking, recounting that after Van Garrett's death, the widow sought what was rightfully hers, but someone sent the horseman and killed her. On the night of the dispute between father and son over the will, young Masbatha's father was called as a witness, and by signing the document, unknowingly signed his own death warrant. Crane then confronts the notary about the power this person wields, having stolen the head of the cursed horseman, now controlling it against its will, but the head must be returned for the evil to go back to where it belongs. The investigator concludes that among all, the only one who could inherit such a fortune and is closer to Van Garrett is Baltus Van Tassel himself. Upon returning to his room, the investigator finds Katrina examining his books and asks if he has discovered something, but he doesn't reveal anything. Katrina then mentions that her father asked him to return to New York after seeing potential accusations in his book. He asks her to leave them alone, and once she's gone, a spider appears and startles Crane. However, young Masbath tries to catch it but discovers something under the investigator's bed. Moving the bed, they find a star-shaped drawing on the floor with writings around it. The young man says someone is using magic against Crane. Later, the investigator, accompanied by the young man, leaves his room and follows a hooded figure. They follow the person through the forest, and as Crane gets closer to observe, he discovers that Baltus's wife is involved with a man. However, she cuts her hand and smears the man with blood. Crane returns home, finding what he just witnessed odd, but he realizes his clues have been stolen. Suspecting the culprit, he goes to the old Van Tassel family cottage, where Katrina is burning the papers. When asked why, she explains that she burned the papers so her father wouldn't be accused. She knows him and believes he wouldn't do such harm. Disheartened by Crane's accusations, she leaves. The investigator later goes to her house, but her stepmother says Katrina doesn't want to talk to him. Before Crane leaves, the lady shows him her wound and tells him she saw him the previous night, asking him not to tell Baltus. Suddenly, Baltus arrives, agitated, as a man has been found hanged, and the town is gathering for a meeting. Moments later, as everyone assembles in the church, Baltus goes to his wife, who's gathering some flowers. Suddenly, the horseman appears behind her and unsheathes his sword. Baltus rides in on his horse, frightened, and informs Katrina that her stepmother has been killed. Everyone enters the church, including Crane. The horseman halts at the entrance of the enclosure, and the investigator realizes the entity cannot enter because the place is sacred. The preacher blames Baltus for what's happening and confronts him, but Baltus takes out a firearm and threatens anyone who comes near. The doctor tries to confess, but the preacher knocks him out. Terrified, Baltus shoots and kills the preacher. The crowd then advances toward Baltus, and his daughter, who's doing something on the ground, watches the scene unfold. The headless horseman grabs a rope and a wooden stake. When Baltus confronts everyone about the conspiracy, he's struck by the stake in the chest and then pulled out, killed by the horseman. Witnessing the horrifying scene, Katrina faints. As Crane gazes at the fallen Katrina, he realizes she drew the symbols in her room and made one within the church. They discover that Katrina is a witch, but goodness prevails in her heart. For young Masbath, this can't be true. Despite the possibility that Katrina might have done all that, the investigator won't take action. They bid farewell, and Crane departs, while Katrina watches him from her room. Inside the carriage, Crane, lost in thought, examines a book he received from Katrina and discovers that the drawings on the ground signify protection for those the artist loves. Crane quickly returns and goes to the morgue, discovering that on the body of Baltus's wife, the incision had been made post-mortem. The scene shifts to Katrina grieving her losses, and suddenly the very much alive lady approaches her stepdaughter. Frightened by this sight, Katrina faints. We then learn that the true witch behind it all is the lady, who had been blending in among the people as a righteous woman, while in her hideaway, she cast her curses. We witness her cutting a strand of Katrina's hair and performing a spell with the horseman's skull, ordering him to rise and seek out Katrina. The lady remarks that the cowardly Baltus didn't want to stay to see the horseman, hastening his inevitable death. Katrina insists she saw the lady's corpse, but it was only that of the maid she herself killed. Young Masbath infiltrates the scene and eavesdrops on their conversation. The lady reveals her family background. They were the archers who served a lord and lived in one of his cottages. However, her father died one day, and they were evicted. She explains that no one in Sleepy Hollow wanted her family because they suspected her mother of practicing witchcraft. Forced to go to the western forests, her mother taught her much before dying a year later. So, she and her sister had to fend for themselves in the woods. One day, while gathering firewood, they encountered the horseman, still possessing his head. She witnessed his death and, harboring ill intentions, offered her soul to the malevolent spirit in exchange for him raising the dead and using them to exact vengeance against the Van Garretts. She desired the same fate for the Van Tessel family, who took their ancestral home. She infiltrated the Van Tessel family's life to set her plan in motion. But as the scheme draws to a close, Katrina stands to inherit the estate, making her the last obstacle. The lady reveals that her sister, the witch the investigator found in the woods, was killed by her own hand so that no one remained. Young Mossbath is about to attack the witch, but he's discovered. He grabs Katrina and helps her escape, under threat of the horseman's capture. Crane arrives at the windmill and finds Katrina with a young man, but the horseman is also approaching. Upon seeing him, the lady hides her head. After the three enter the windmill, they lock the doors upstairs. However, the horseman soon breaks in as well. Crane instructs them to climb up and activates the windmill, hatching an idea. The headless horseman smashes through the door and pursues the three. He nearly hits the investigator, but Crane ascends the stairs and escapes through the opening in the ceiling. He throws a lantern to the ground, setting the place on fire. Then, they climb onto the windmill's blades and descend safely to the ground. They move away from the windmill, which eventually explodes. Unfortunately, this doesn't stop what's already dead. The three get into the carriage and begin to flee, with the horseman following closely. Realizing the enemy is approaching rapidly, Crane aims his gun to shoot at him, but he discovers that the malevolent spirit is already on the carriage. He fires at it, thinking he brought it down. He lays down to observe his surroundings, but the horseman, who's now on the carriage, almost beheads him. Crane confronts him and orders Katrina and the young man to jump onto the horses. The carriage hits a log, snapping the connection with the horses. Crane clings to the reins and is dragged, while the horseman on the carriage is thrown off when it veers off the road, ultimately falling on him. However, the spirit rises and continues the pursuit. Meanwhile, the three stop near the tree of the dead. The lady surrounds them, shooting Crane. Then, she seizes Katrina, intending to have the horseman kill her. Crane, still alive, notices a bag the lady is carrying and lunges to knock it away. Seeing the horseman's skull, Crane tries to take it, but the lady intervenes. Young Mossbath strikes her with a piece of wood, allowing Crane to grab the skull. Thankfully, before the evil could kill Katrina, Crane summons the horseman and throws him his skull, leading to the entity placing it back in its rightful place. The horseman's body regenerates. Crane embraces Katrina and thanks her for the book, which shielded him from the bullet. The terrifying-looking horseman refrains from harming the three, but he seizes the lady and carries her away to his grave. The film ends by showing us sometime later, where everything has returned to normal. The forests are healthy, and animals graze peacefully. Back in New York, the couple, Crane and Katrina, stroll through the bustling streets covered in snow.